Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is an October garden tour. October is going to be a month the garden really changes. We're already started to pull out some of the annuals that were through this, what we call the swoosh here. This will be replaced with pansies and snapdragons and some bulbs and other things pretty soon. And a lot more to come out. You're going to see a lot more annuals that over the course of October for sure will definitely start to slow down. We're in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. Please feel free to follow along with the channel if you haven't thus far. We did a weekly tour most of the year, but we've skipped a few weeks because not much was happening there in the early fall, but a lot of things are still looking pretty good right now. So we're going to show it off for October. One of those things is this white Calicarpa Americana. I got this one from Buddy Lee a while ago, and he picked this selection to be more compact than the regular Calicarpa Americana Alba, and you can see just how loaded this thing actually is. Once these get a little age on them, the birds will come along and take care of them pretty quickly. The robins love them and other birds as well. The last 2 seasons it's been cleaned out. The first year it was only this big and had a few on it when I brought it back from Louisiana, and then last year same thing, but this year it's completely full. Going around here, we're pretty excited about, it took forever, but we finally have some monarch caterpillars here out by the road. It's a little late, but they should start to form their chrysalis here in the next, hopefully next day or so. And there's quite a few. We won't show them all to you, but there are 2 right there that you could see in the camera. Other things still looking good. This vinca has been, one of the stars of the landscape this year. A lot of the perennials are starting to go to sleep now, and so the agastache and other things are really, it's dry as well. I mean, it's really, really dry going into fall this year, and so these perennials are just going, okay, I'm out, and they're just going away pretty quickly. The annuals continue to flower because it has stayed warm, but again, by the time you guys see this garden again in November, all of this annual color will be gone except for some pansies, snapdragons, dianthus will be planted in here, maybe some other showy leafy things like kale or flowering kale, cabbage, that kind of thing. But I think the entry still looks great, and we have a lot of things to plant as these annuals come out, and we've got a little bit of transplanting to do. We've got a few things that are pretty close together that we know we have to move about, but it's been so full in here with all the annual and perennial color, we haven't really known what space is available to transplant. So a few things will be transplanted, a few more things will be going into the landscape. The Henryi Clematis is still rocking and rolling here. That's 2 flowers back to back, but you can see how large the flowers are on that one. I think next year we'll see all of these Clematis that are planted along the fence really looking good. You can see a few more of the monarch caterpillars on the other side of the fence entryway as well. Other perennials over there, again, starting to go to sleep, all the cone flowers, but the asters still super popular with the bees right now. They're working those over pretty good, and lots of fall flowering things out here. The Caryopteris, which for whatever weird reason started blooming early in the summer this year, is now kind of what I would call peak color at this point. You can see bees just absolutely all over it. The Empress of China dogwood, some of the fruit is finally turning, or the seed is finally turning red on it. There's lots of them. It got so dry and hot early in the summer that about the time it stopped blooming, a lot of these actually fell off, but it has held on to some, so doesn't have quite as much of the red on it as I would like, but it's still beautiful. A little further down the fence over here, we had planted some black-eyed Susan vines that we did from seed. We have a guide wire holding up a light pole here next to us, and the purpose of that was to grow up that wire. It's made it about 2/3 of the way up the wire at this point, maybe not quite that high, and it's on everything over there. I wish I'd have spent a little more time working on it early on, making sure it was climbing rather than climbing through the shrubs and everything, but it is super colorful, and it's done the job that we wanted it to do over there. Again, this side of the annual border, a lot of it's been torn out. Some celosia is still there in place, and we'll, as long as the bees are on it, we're happy with that. You can see the pink Vinca still looks great. That area's looked great all summer, really. This slightly disappointing annual border along the turf in the front where this Gomphrena wasn't as colorful as we wanted. It looks good. I mean, you know, and the bees are all over it. The Ageratum, the Gomphrena, the African Basil back there. The African Basil is still covered in bees right now as I'm talking. This Mexican sage is now in full flower, and bees are all absolutely working this thing all day long, as you would expect for any salvia. Steph has gone in here behind these annuals and taken out that purple celosia that everyone loves so much. It's gone because it was eating some of the perennials back here. So we had to kind of defend some of the perennials toward the end of the season from the annuals. The annuals go so aggressively, and the first year the perennials are in the ground, you know, a lot of times they're just sitting there gaining energy, gaining what they need, and then they'll take off next year. In the meantime, the annuals were trying to kill them. So we have, you know, done a little work in that regard, and, you know, coming all the way around. By the time you guys see this landscape again, all of these annuals will be gone. All of this will be torn out. Some shrubs will be moved around. We'll show that. Some other, I would call it specialty plants. There'll be a video at some point you'll see on specialty plants, just some unusual things we've gathered up here in the last few months that we're waiting for places to plant. That video will be going up. Camellias are definitely going to start stealing the show out here. We've got the crimson and clover Camellia, which is probably the earliest blooming sasanqua that we have. I wouldn't call it full flower because this one flowers over a very long period of time. It has lots of flower buds on it and appears to still be forming some small flower buds, but you see the color on it. And as the nights have started getting cooler, and I can already see that this thing is a little more of kind of a wine color now. It was redder a few weeks back, or 3 weeks ago when you guys saw the first bloom on it. And as the nights get cooler, as the daytime temperatures get cooler, the soil gets cooler, the flower becomes kind of a wine color, which is interesting that it's changeable during the fall. A few interesting things on this side of the front garden. One of the reasons that this Rosalinda Indian Hawthorne is not the hardiest thing in the world is it decides to put on 6 or 8 inches of growth right before the season ends. So a lot of that's definitely going to get burned over the winter time. As soon as it cooled off, I think it was so hot and dry that it just couldn't put on any growth, and it decided to do it right at the end of the season. So again, is what it is. Pineapple sage is always one of those super interesting perennials. It's marginally hardy here in 7B, and not really. I think on any list you see it'll be zone 8 and higher. This one's in a slightly protected spot. It's come back one time now, so I think it'll always come back. It's such an interesting perennial though. It'll just sit here and be this tall almost all season. It's 3.5 feet tall or so right now. It'll end up probably 4 feet tall before we end up with a frost, and it'll be in full flower. And that all happened in probably the last 3 weeks. Almost all of that growth. As soon as the nighttime temperatures started to cool, the days got a little shorter, it went and got in a hurry real quick. It's got its first flower buds on it now. So we'll start to see the color on this, which is, you know, contrast wildly with this gold foliage. So when that happens, I'll definitely have some photos of this on Instagram. And we've got one more over there behind where Steph is filming, but it's so new that hasn't, again, a lot of these perennials the first year aren't going to do anything. Next year it'll do exactly what this one's done. And then we've got this Cestrum Parkii back here, literally never stops blooming. It has bloomed since the end of May. Has a really funky smell to it as soon as I started touching it and moving it just then. I hadn't smelled it before then. It's got a really odd smell, but all of the pollinators just love this plant. There's some Sarcococa down below the Edgeworthia here that's budded up like crazy to flower. It's looking fantastic. Eventually this Edgeworthia will be limbed up more and it'll have a little bit of space under here, but it's completely happy right now, and it will bloom in February into March. It's super fragrant, but the flowers aren't particularly showy. There's a lot of those kind of fragrant plants where you got to go look for the flower on them almost, but Sarcococa definitely falls into that category. The Edgeworthia has gone completely nuts, and this is about as fast as I've ever seen an Edgeworthia grow. It's only been in the ground a little over a year, and it was a tiny little 1 gallon plant when it was put in the ground. We got this from I think from Jason Stevens. I don't even remember now. It was in a 1 gallon container. Look at all the flower buds on it. Every single one of these branches has 3 flower buds on it, which is kind of interesting because this thing always branches in 3s. I think this has been talked about on the channel before. It branches in 3s. The flower clusters there are in 3, and after it flowers in the spring, these will each branch into 3s, but it does that all the time. Look at last year where it branched in 3. Look at that, even the year before that, or the time before that, it branched in 3. Kind of interesting. It always does that, and it ends up in a very uniform habit because of that. We're gonna head into the back garden space and show off some things that weren't flowering the last time we had a garden tour, and the first one would be this gray ghost Alyssium. A lot of these Alyssium bloom in the fall as the days get shorter. Gray ghost has that white, here's this white flower. It's really a amazing variegation on this plant. It's a perfect name for it. Took a little while to settle into that space. This area is extremely dry. This is the area of the landscape that is almost dry, even for things that would like it kind of dry. The Osmanthus, the orange flowering Osmanthus, has grown okay, but it definitely ends up under stress quite a bit. I think it'll be better next year. I'm gonna do a little bit of pruning on it in the late winter, get the height down a bit. It had a few flowers on it in the last week or two. Those are kind of spent. It's really dry, so these were not as big, not as showy, and definitely not as fragrant, but you can see they are orange. We'll get a few more during the winter months. During the warm days in the winter months, hoping for some rain, though, I think would be most helpful to get that Osmanthus flowering, anemone flowering, some of the seedling dahlias still looking really, really great. This side of the garden, they look much better than the other side, actually. You can see this bee is enjoying that one. Lots of different ones here. There's another anemone here. This is that one that's out by the front gate, isn't it? It's similar to that one out by the front. The Chinese snowball viburnum has started to open some flowers. This is very typical of it. It blooms heavily in the spring, and then will repeat bloom in the fall. As this plant matures, these will be inflorescences this big. It's still a small plant, and again, dry. Dry for sure. The sunshine ligustrum got a big haircut a few weeks back, but you can see the new growth coming out on it. Looks great, and bright colored again. The regular Osmanthus fragrans is in really full flower a week to 2 weeks ago. But even it, I can tell, is definitely decided to shed some flowers here because it's dry. Really kind of almost pointless to even try to water right now. It's so dry. But we've got this hurricane, down in Florida. I hope everybody is okay from, but it's supposed to bring us some water relief because it is amazingly dry, especially now that I'm out here looking around today. The annual border across the back turf is definitely it's starting to look a little tough. These will come out here in the next week or two, and that's how we're making the decision on pulling out these things. We're just basing it on, is it still performing well for pollinators that are still here? And that's whatever, butterflies, bees, wasps, we don't care what it is. If it's something still enjoying it, it stays in place for now. But definitely all these salvias especially are slowing down, except for rhythm and blues salvia. This is one of the latest ones to get started in the season. It takes a long time for this one to wake up. It's marginally hardy here in Zone 7B. And then once it decides to establish itself, it can really take over a big area. This one is going to need a little bit of control next year when it comes back out of the ground. But I do love it, and it continues to bloom well into fall. A lot of these salvias, these southern salvias, really, this is the time of year they almost look their best. And there's just bees constantly on this. This is the hummingbirds. The cestrum out front, there's a few other things, but this might be right at the top of the hummingbirds list. The Grand Cascade butterfly bush. This is the 3rd year in a row it's been It got slid back last winter. If you've been following along with the channel, it was too close to the lawn back here. We slid it back a bit. Every foot something goes back in this lawn back here, or back behind this lawn, the shadier it gets. So I was wondering if we were going to get too much shade on this, but it really hasn't stretched at all. Have we pruned this summer?
I don't think so, but we're definitely deadheaded.
Okay, so it's been deadheaded some, you know, meaning the spent flower buds have been taken off of it a couple times, but that's it. It hasn't had any other kind of control to it. So really good size for a butterfly bush, because a lot of them are, you know, very, very dwarf or, you know, absolutely gigantic. We have one of those out front. This is a really good landscape size. I think the view around the back porch area still looks great. A lot of these, the pentas have really held up well going into fall, dry, shorter days, less sunlight. They're doing pretty well. The vinca as well. The October Magic Orchid has opened its first flower. The first flowers you get on your camellias every year will be the smallest flower you're going to have all season. So that one's only about less than 2 inches across, but this thing is absolutely loaded in flower buds. So a second camellia in bloom. So the Farfugium on the back line, we're finally starting to see some flower spikes form in the middle of them here at the beginning of October. Pretty normal for those that bloom in the month of October. And the pollinators absolutely love them. Another thing that's about to bloom is the soft caress Mahonia. You see that thing budded up, and it'll bloom pretty much on and off through the winter months. Anytime we've got some warmth. Moving on from that, there's a few annuals that will come out in patience there. But the Mojo Pittosporum looks great. The contorted Japanese maple that finally went in the ground looks good in the middle of those. I love this purple ajuga with the Mojo Pittosporum. I like interplanting things like that if we need to, we can pull a little bit of that ajuga back to let that, to make sure that Pittosporum has plenty of room, an opportunity to compete. But again, covering the roots up on a lot of these things, they're protecting each other from direct sunlight, and both of them look healthier because of it. One other camellia beyond that is October Magic Ruby, and it is loaded with flower buds, and I mean loaded, but we haven't seen one open yet. We've got cool nights, so I expect any day now all the other Camellia sasanquas in the landscape will start opening flowers. And I'm digging around in here on our other Farfugium looking for flower spikes, and I just don't see any yet. But I think here in the next week or so, we'll see it on this one. We have two other Farfugium that are going to go in this back line, and Steph has said we should turn this whole back line into Farfugium because it's so oddly dry and the soil's so different back here. We have struggled to establish things on this back line. I don't want to water so much, and so it's been difficult to find things that work well. Hellebores work great, the dry shade. The aspidestra or the cast iron plants are obviously going to work well, and the Farfugium and the Mahonia. There's a few things back here, but other things have kind of struggled. The hosta have kind of struggled, and if we don't give them extra water, and I don't really want a landscape that's not going to become resilient. It doesn't have to be resilient day one, but at some point it needs to be resilient, and I don't want to be watering something 4 years later that's been in the ground that long just when it's mildly dry. But that's what we've had to do in this back area. So there's a snapshot of what's going on here in the garden in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. Holly has been, I don't know how many times she's been in the video, but she's all around constantly. So thank you guys for following along.